in the heart of the deep south, where the sun scorched the red earth and the air hung thick with the scent of cotton. An invisible war was fought each day, one not waged with bullets, but with sweat, silence, and survival. Before the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, the enslaved were already awake, their bodies aching from the previous day's toil, their spirits steeling themselves for the battle to come. There were no sirens to mark the beginning of their shift, only the cold, mechanical crack of a gunshot from the overseer's pistol, echoing through the dark fields. That sound was not just a signal, it was a command, a threat, a beginning to another day of calculated endurance. This story is not one you will often find in school textbooks. It is the untold reality of cotton plantations in 19th century America, an economic empire built not just on cotton, but on control, on cruelty, and on the relentless dehumanization of an entire people. It was a system that transformed living, breathing individuals into tools measured not by their thoughts or dreams, but by pounds of cotton picked and quotas met. The cotton might have been white, but the cost was red, soaked into the soil through blood, sweat, and generations of suffering. What we are about to uncover is not merely history. It is a window into a machinery of oppression so refined, so methodical, that it turned torture into policy and punishment into profit. But even in the harshest fields, even under the cruelest overseers, there were moments of resistance, small sparks of defiance, quiet acts of survival, and voices that refused to be silenced. If stories like these matter to you, if the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, deserves to be told, then take a moment now to support this channel. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the stories history tried to forget. Your support helps keep these voices alive. This is not a tale of the past alone. It is a mirror reflecting the human capacity for both darkness and resilience. And today, we walk with those who endured the unthinkable, not as nameless figures in the shadows, but as real people whose lives shaped the world we live in. This is their story, and it starts here, beneath the morning sky, where hope and suffering met with every cotton boll picked. The sun had barely cleared the tree line when the sound of footsteps filled the fields, bare feet against hard-packed earth, moving in rhythm not to freedom, but to obligation. The air was already thick, heavy with the moisture of the southern dawn, clinging to skin and clothing like a second layer. But the heat was the least of their concerns. What loomed largest in every worker's mind was the number, the quota that haunted each waking moment. 150 pounds of cotton. Some plantations demanded 200. This was not a suggestion. It was the line between punishment and survival. To understand the weight of such a number, you must first understand the crop itself. Cotton is not soft in the field. It grows surrounded by sharp, bird casings that cut and slice the fingers of anyone who dares to pick it too quickly. It demands precision and speed, two things rarely compatible when exhaustion has hollowed out your body and blistered your hands. Enslaved men, women, and even children were expected to move quickly, stripping the cotton from its thorny prison, both hands working in practiced unison. It was not enough to work hard. You had to work flawlessly and endlessly. The day began before light touched the fields and ended only when darkness made the cotton indistinguishable from the soil. But even then, rest was not guaranteed. On some plantations, those who failed to meet their quota were kept working under lamplight, their shadows cast long and thin across the rows. Sleep became a privilege, not a necessity, often traded for another chance to avoid the overseer's anger. The body begged for rest. The spirit longed for peace. But there was only the cotton and the number. Those who labored in these fields developed calluses that wrapped around their fingers like armor. Yet even that protection was not enough. Fingers bled. Joints stiffened. And still, the baskets had to be filled. Mary Reynolds, who later recounted her life on a Louisiana plantation during an interview with the Federal Writers Project, described the sensation as fighting the plant itself. Every handful a battle waged against a living enemy. By the end of the day, her hands would be raw, wrapped in scraps of cloth torn from what little clothing she had, the fabric soaked in blood and sweat. And still, the baskets had to be filled. On the Butler plantation in Georgia, failure to meet the day's mark brought not just the shame of unmet expectations, but the certainty of consequences. The workers there, like in so many places across the South, knew that numbers were sacred. If the scale read light, discipline followed. Sometimes lashes, sometimes isolation, and often the extension of the workday into the night. The fields, already heavy with silence during the day, became almost ghost-like after sunset, lit by flickering lanterns and haunted by the sound of weary limbs dragging through dust. The pressure to meet these quotas was not arbitrary. It was systemic, embedded in plantation ledgers, passed between overseers like a secret code. Landowners believed that with the right blend of fear, hunger, and routine, productivity could always be increased. And they were not wrong in the mechanical sense. Cotton production boomed. The American South became an economic powerhouse, feeding a global demand for textiles, but that wealth came at a price, a human cost measured not just in suffering, but in the steady unraveling of minds and bodies. Field hands were often pushed to the point of collapse, their legs giving way beneath them, muscles unable to answer the demands of the day. A journal entry from a plantation owner in Louisiana noted matter-of-factly, "Lost 2 field hands to the heat today. Production must continue." There was no pause, no reflection, just the unbending rhythm of commerce. A person's life weighed less than a bale of cotton. Sleep, too, became a casualty of the system. The body's natural repair cycle, its most basic need, was seen as expendable if it interfered with output. The Dockery plantation in Mississippi operated under a cruel policy known as the sundown rule, where any worker who failed to meet their target was kept in the fields past sunset, working until the goal was met, regardless of exhaustion. It was not uncommon for workers to be awakened in the dead of night and told to continue picking under torchlight, while others rested nearby, too afraid to protest. This was not punishment for rebellion. It was punishment for being human. Still, they endured, day after day, their shoulders bent under the weight of expectations that had no ceiling. The quotas climbed higher in profitable years, and rarely dropped even in poor ones. To the overseers, the human machine could always be fine-tuned. Its output increased. But for those in the rows, the cost was personal. Chronic injuries, failing eyesight, broken spirits. Yet in this dark arithmetic, there was something the ledgers never accounted for: resilience. Despite every effort to break them, to erase their sense of self, those forced into this labor remembered who they were. They passed down songs between rows, humming melodies that carried hidden meanings. They looked after one another when illness struck. They prayed not always for salvation, but sometimes just for the strength to survive one more sunrise. The cotton field was not just a site of labor. It was a battlefield of endurance, a test of the human spirit under impossible conditions. Every pound picked was a defiance of the system. Every morning survived was a quiet victory. And in those fields, beneath the punishing southern sun, lived stories not just of suffering, but of strength, dignity, and a will that refused to vanish. The sun was not just a fixture in the sky, it was a weapon, rising like a silent overseer of its own. It scorched the earth by mid-morning, blanketing the cotton fields in waves of suffocating heat. But relief never came. Enslaved workers, already weakened from lack of food and sleep, found themselves forced to toil for hours beneath its unforgiving glare. The punishment was not only the labor. It was in the manipulation of the very environment they worked in. Overseers, aware of the physical toll of dehydration and sun exposure, did not just ignore it, they used it. Access to water was strictly controlled, with barrels rationed and often placed far from the picking lines, forcing laborers to weigh the cost of walking away from their rows. For many, even lifting their heads for too long could earn them a lash or a shouted command to move faster. As the hours dragged on, tongues thickened, lips cracked, and thoughts blurred. Some collapsed, some vomited from heat exhaustion. And still, the work continued. They were made to wear coarse, heavy clothing, shirts thick with homespun fibers, trousers ill-fitting and rough. It was not for protection. It was deliberate. Even in the sweltering summer months, there was no allowance for breathable garments. Sweat soaked the fabric by mid-morning, clinging to skin like a second punishment. These clothes chafed against sunburnt backs and infected wounds. But changing them or shedding layers was not permitted. Instead, they had to keep their heads low and their hands moving, dragging sacks behind them that grew heavier with each hour. The weight of the cotton was not only physical. Each day came with strict quotas. Some fields demanded a yield of 150 to 200 pounds per person, regardless of age or strength. And if someone could not meet it, they paid in pain. This quota was not simply a benchmark, it was a threat hanging over every picker's head. Falling short meant having to stay late into the night, sometimes lit only by torches. Their shadows cast long over the fields as they searched desperately for a few more bowls to meet. The count, the fear of failing was constant, but the body could only endure so much. Fatigue would hit like a wall. Arms would go numb, legs would falter, and backs would stiffen into painful arcs. But there was no room for compassion. Overseers rode on horseback, barking orders or cracking whips in the air as warnings. Some carried ledgers, tracking weight by the hour, ensuring every worker knew they were being watched. These tactics were not just about control, they were about breaking spirit. The fewer questions asked, the less resistance stirred, the better the yield. Children were not spared either. From an early age, they were expected to contribute, often assigned to pluck leaves or gather fallen cotton near the base of the plants. Small hands worked as hard as any adults, and any hesitation was met with the same level of discipline. Mothers could not comfort them during the day. Fathers had no power to protect them. Family bonds were constantly tested and often shattered not just by sale or separation but by the shared, relentless grind of survival. And yet, somehow, they endured. In whispered songs and shared glances, they found fragments of resistance, tiny, flickering reminders of selfhood in a world that tried to erase it. Water passed hand to hand when overseers looked away. Old men offered quiet advice about which rows grew thicker bowls, which overseers had weaker eyes. Elder women muttered prayers in languages not fully remembered, their voices soft enough to escape notice but loud enough to preserve something precious. There were moments when the heat grew so intense that the air shimmered, bending the view of distant trees and turning the sky a white so bright it hurt the eyes. During those moments, breath became shallow, and time seemed to distort. But still, they worked, because stopping was not an option, because beneath the weight of cotton, the weight of heat, and the weight of oppression, there was also the invisible weight of one's own life, of a beating heart that refused to quit. Nightfall was no savior. It merely marked the end of the field labor and the start of new challenges. Sorting, bundling, hauling cotton into storage. And for many, the night brought only a few hours of rest on wooden floors or cramped quarters. Bodies sore from bending, skin scorched by sun and scratched by branches, found no peace. Food was scarce, rest was brief, and dawn would return far too quickly. What makes this story worth telling is not just the suffering, it is the strength it reveals. against every effort to reduce them to tools. These individuals remained human. In every breath they took, every step they forced their aching legs to make, they resisted erasure. And though many of their names have been lost to time, their stories remain etched in the soil they once walked, fields that bore witness not only to crops and profits, but to unimaginable perseverance. If you have made it this far in the story, take a moment to reflect on what they endured. These were not faceless statistics, they were people with dreams, families, and resilience that history tried to silence. If their strength moved you, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Through stories like this, we ensure that the past is not forgotten and that dignity, even in its most stolen forms, is remembered. As the sun scorched the earth and the weight of cotton dragged on sore backs, there was no promise of relief waiting at the end of the day. For the enslaved workers on the cotton plantations, the brief moments of rest were haunted by hunger as much as by exhaustion. Food so essential, so basic, was scarcely more than another weapon of control. After long hours of back-breaking labor in the blazing southern heat, most workers returned to cabins that were bare of comfort and nourishment. What passed for a meal was typically a small ration of cornmeal mush, occasionally accompanied by scraps of pork, often the parts not sold at market, feet, fatback, or organs. This was not food chosen for sustenance or care. It was the minimum needed to keep a body moving, just enough to pick another day's quota. The portions were calculated not by nutritionists, but by overseers who saw every mouth as a cost, and every weakened body as replaceable. No fresh fruits, no greens, no dairy. Children were weaned early, sometimes denied even a full mother's feeding, as both mother and child were expected to labor. Infants received watery cornmeal mixtures that could never substitute for breast milk, stunting their growth before they had a chance to stand on their own feet. The result was predictable and tragic. Bodies withered from lack of protein and essential vitamins. Diseases like pellagra, caused by niacin deficiency, ran rampant. Swollen bellies, brittle hair, and persistent lethargy marked the youngest, many of whom would never reach adulthood. Wounds healed slowly, if at, bones fractured easily, teeth decayed in mouths that rarely smiled. The starvation was not always overt. It was not always about withholding food. Sometimes, it was about the slow erosion of strength and dignity through repetitive, unchanging diets that the body could not thrive on. Workers might have filled their stomachs, but their muscles remained weak, their minds dulled from constant fatigue. And when illness came, as it often did, there was no medicine, no rest, and no pity. A sick worker who could not pick their weight in cotton was often punished, or worse, deemed useless. For children born into this world, hunger shaped everything. It dictated whether they could run or sit, whether they could speak or merely moan. It shortened attention spans and made learning impossible. Though some plantation owners allowed a few hours of religious instruction or manual education, most enslaved children grew up knowing little more than the sound of their own stomachs gnawing at them during the night. The future they inherited was not one of growth, but of survival if they were lucky. And still, the work never slowed. A child of 8 might be assigned lighter cotton-picking duties, or carry water for others, but their small frame did not protect them from the quotas or the lash. If they failed to bring in their expected bundle, it was often the mother who was punished, creating an agonizing link between hunger, failure, and family pain. Those who dared to sneak into plantation gardens or steal extra food were swiftly and brutally punished. Theft, even of a single piece of fruit, was seen not as a cry for help but as rebellion. Such acts were met with whippings, shackles, or days without food, further deepening the very hunger that had driven them. The cycle was vicious and unrelenting. In rare instances, enslaved people were able to maintain small gardens behind their cabins, growing okra, collard greens, or sweet potatoes. These plots were Lifeline's tiny green rebellions against a world that sought to starve them. But not every plantation permitted such plots. And even when they did, the burden of tending them fell on shoulders already heavy with exhaustion. The psychological toll of chronic malnutrition was just as profound as the physical. Workers described moments of dizziness so intense they feared falling into the rows and being trampled by wagons. Others recalled hallucinations under the sun, visions of tables full of warm bread, stews, and cool water. These were not dreams of luxury, just of decency, meals that many today would consider humble, but that to them seemed like unreachable feasts. Night after night, these dreams faded into the reality of bare wooden bowls and cold, tasteless mush. No one asked for seconds. Because there were none, elders gave their portions to children. Mothers watched their infants cry with mouths they could not fill. Fathers buried sons who never learned to walk. And yet, amidst the scarcity, a different kind of strength emerged, a communal resilience forged in hunger. Workers shared what little they had, passed down recipes that stretched flavor from the thinnest broth, and sang songs that told of freedom, justice, and hope. They braided stories into mealtime rituals, whispered old African herbal knowledge, and preserved bits of culture through food when nothing else could be kept. Hunger, like heat and labor, was a tool meant to break them, but even as it weakened their bodies, it could not completely sever their sense of self. Starved but not silent, exhausted but not erased, they endured. The story of their suffering is not just one of deprivation. It is one of survival in the face of a system that weaponized everything, even the most basic human need, to maintain control. Their endurance must be remembered not as a distant past, but as a lesson etched into the roots of modern society. What they endured in silence deserves to be spoken aloud today, not to reopen wounds, but to honor the resilience that hunger could not defeat. Under the relentless southern sun, the fields stretched endlessly, their white blossoms deceptively soft in appearance. But for the enslaved people forced to harvest them, cotton was a cruel master. Every day, before the horizon began to glow with morning light, women and even children were awakened by the sharp commands of overseers. There was no time to stretch, no time to breathe. Their hands were already expected to be reaching for the prickly cotton bowls, their backs bent under the invisible weight of expectation. The daily quota loomed 150 to 200 pounds, impossible numbers that pushed human bodies to the brink of collapse. If someone slowed down, tripped, or stopped to wipe the sweat from their brow, there was no compassion, only threat. Meeting those quotas was not just expected, it was demanded, with consequences attached to every failure. But cotton plants did not yield their fluff easily. Fingers bled from thorns, backs ached from endless stooping, and minds grew numb under the weight of exhaustion. Yet the demands did not lessen. At times, desperate to make their numbers, people picked by moonlight, staggering through the rows half blind, hungry, and worn. Sleep became a stolen luxury, not a right, and the few hours allowed for rest were often filled with the groans of bodies unable to recover before the next day began. And still, the cruelty did not end with labor. Overseers, well aware of how the sweltering southern climate could weaken the body, turned the environment itself into a weapon. Water was rationed, denied as punishment, or deliberately placed out of reach. Dehydration was common, but relief was scarce. In some plantations, enslaved people were forced to wear layers of heavy, coarse clothing even in the peak of summer, their sweat soaking through the fabric, further draining what little strength remained. The sun, once a symbol of life, became a tool of suffering. Nutrition, too, was a calculated cruelty. Meals consisted of little more than cornmeal and leftover pork scraps, barely enough to keep a child alive, let alone a grown person working 16-hour days. Malnutrition was rampant. Children failed to grow properly, their development stunted not by genetics but by deliberate neglect. Illness spread quietly but steadily, often untreated. Those who could not work were deemed useless, their suffering ignored, their lives reduced to statistics in the plantations' ledgers. And when the body broke or the spirit resisted, punishment followed with terrifying efficiency. The lash of the whip tore into skin not just as a punishment, but as a message. Pain was the language of control. Iron collars, often spiked or designed to restrict movement, were locked around necks to mark those who disobeyed or tried to escape. Sleep deprivation devices, including masks that kept heads upright or bells that rang with every nod, ensured that even rest became a battleground. The goal was never just physical labor. It was psychological domination, the breaking of the will, the erasure of identity. These methods were not improvised cruelties, they were parts of a system, refined over generations, a system where control was maintained not by bars or chains alone, but by exhaustion, hunger, and fear. In such a world, the human spirit became the last frontier of resistance. Some fought back silently with a glance, a prayer, or a whispered word of hope passed from one hand to another. Others held on because they knew they must, for their children, for the ones who had already been lost, for a future that might still come. This was the daily reality on many cotton plantations in the Deep South, a reality not defined solely by labor, but by a calculated, layered system of deprivation and torment. And though these stories may be difficult to hear, remembering them is essential. They are not only part of history, they are reminders of resilience, of the cost of injustice, and of the power of memory to resist silence. The ledger was not bound in gold or leather, nor did it sit on a scholar's shelf. It lay in the overseer's quarters, rough, worn, and stained by the hands that turned its pages daily. This was no ordinary book. To those who wrote in it, it was a tool of management. To those whose names filled its pages, it was a catalogue of torment. Some called it the Book of Pain. Each line in this grim record was a reflection of a calculated decision, one that equated suffering with profit. Names were written down not for reward or recognition, but to document punishment. Whipping quotas, hours deprived of sleep, time spent shackled, all listed with methodical precision. It was not merely cruelty, it was efficiency. In the eyes of the plantation economy, every lashing had a metric, and every bruise was a line item in a ledger of power. The deeper one delves into this world, the more chilling the system becomes. The enslaved were not just expected to survive the unbearable, they were expected to outperform one another under the weight of pain. If a person lagged in their daily cotton quota, the overseer's solution was not to reassess conditions, but to increase punishment until the body either yielded more cotton or broke entirely. Pain became policy. Plantation managers studied the effects of punishment like modern businesses analyze performance data. If a field hand's cotton yield increased after a whipping, the event would be recorded as a success. If others improved their output from witnessing such punishment, that, too, was noted. The whip cracked not only on the flesh of one, but echoed in the minds of many. It was psychological warfare, choreographed in ink and paper. The Book of Pain was not just about physical consequences. It recorded strategic intimidation. A mother beaten in front of her children. A man restrained with iron spikes after resisting a command. A teenager forced to stand for days in stocks for dropping below the quota. These punishments were not simply reactive, they were deliberate, orchestrated performances meant to ripple through the enslaved community. Fear was the currency, and this ledger was its ledger. Even more disturbing was how this cruelty became a point of pride among some overseers. Letters and diaries from that era, some still preserved in archives, reveal that certain managers shared successful techniques for extracting more labor. A heavier hand here, an iron collar there, all justified by the increase in productivity recorded in the book. It was not just about running a plantation. It was about optimizing the human engine, no matter the cost. This approach reflected a broader philosophy embedded in the plantation system, a belief that enslaved people were tools to be adjusted, calibrated, and driven to the edge for maximum yield. The system left no space for compassion. Those who resisted or collapsed were noted as liabilities. Those who bore the punishment and kept moving were labeled efficient, a term that erased their suffering in favor of numbers. There were, of course, quiet acts of defiance. Some tore out pages when no one watched. Others faked illness, passed secret warnings, or helped each other bear the blows in silence. But these were dangerous risks. If discovered, their names would return to the book, with red ink or harsher lines. What makes this history even more haunting is how ordinary it became. For many who managed these operations, the book was not a symbol of horror, but just another tool like a plow or a scale, a means to an end. They believed in its necessity, unaware or uncaring of the soul-crushing toll it took on those forced to live under its shadow. The legacy of this system lives on, not just in historical records, but in the generational trauma passed down through stories, silences, and scars. The Book of Pain may not be physically present today, but the logic that once filled its pages, the idea that human life is only as valuable as its productivity, still echoes in many corners of modern society. To understand the lives of the enslaved, one must look beyond the cotton fields and into these hidden systems of control. It was not just the whip or the iron that broke people, it was the careful, intentional structure that turned suffering into policy. That is the cruel brilliance of the ledger. And this is why we must continue telling these stories. Behind each number was a name. Behind each line, a life. These ledgers were meant to erase individuality and reduce existence to performance. But by remembering them, by speaking their names and understanding their pain, we reclaim the humanity that these books tried to strip away. If this story has moved you, consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue sharing these untold histories, truths that challenge us to never forget, and to never allow such systems to rise again. Your support ensures that these stories remain more than ink on a page, they remain a living memory, a call for justice, and a promise that we will not look away. Beneath the relentless sun and the endless rows of cotton, the true cost of this brutal labor extended far beyond bruised backs and blistered hands. While the daily quotas and punishments captured much attention, an equally devastating enemy lurked quietly in the cramped quarters where enslaved workers lived, the invisible and insidious threat of disease. The fields might have been a battlefield of sweat and toil, but the cramped cabins, with their poor sanitation and overcrowding, became breeding grounds for illnesses that slowly claimed lives and shattered communities. The unsanitary living conditions on plantations created the perfect storm for infections to thrive. Cabins were overcrowded, often housing more than a dozen people in spaces scarcely large enough to stretch out. Dirt floors, poor ventilation, and contaminated water sources combined to create a toxic environment where diseases flourished. Cuts and wounds inflicted by sharp cotton bolls or rough labor rarely received proper treatment. Instead, they often became entry points for infections. What began as a simple abrasion could rapidly turn into severe, sometimes fatal, conditions. One particular affliction, colloquially called cotton blood poisoning, was a common diagnosis among plantation workers. It was a deadly infection caused by bacteria entering through cuts and was feared for how quickly it could claim a life. Many survivors recounted heartbreaking stories of loved ones who began with a minor injury and were gone within days. Respiratory illnesses were another silent killer. The very crop that promised wealth also carried a hidden curse. The fine cotton dust that filled the air during harvesting penetrated deep into workers' lungs. Over time, this dust caused a chronic condition known as cotton lung, or by its medical name, bisonosis. Symptoms included persistent coughing, wheezing, and difficulty breathing, symptoms that only worsened as years passed, without any medical care or understanding of the disease. Many workers were left to deteriorate slowly, their lungs filled with fibers that hardened and scarred tissue. Plantation doctors, when they were present, often dismissed these ailments or offered treatments that were ineffective at best, sometimes experimenting cruelly on patients without consent. Tuberculosis, referred to then as consumption, was rampant in the densely packed quarters where enslaved families tried to rest after exhausting days. Malnutrition and weakened immune systems made the workers especially vulnerable. The disease spread swiftly through coughing and close contact, turning homes into sites of slow, painful decline. The mortality rate was staggering. In some plantations, nearly half of the population might succumb to consumption within a few years. There were few, if any, remedies, and death was often met with indifference by the overseers, who viewed workers as replaceable tools rather than human lives. Another widespread affliction was pellagra, a disease caused by niacin deficiency due to poor diets limited almost exclusively to cornmeal and pork scraps. Pellagra caused symptoms like diarrhea, dermatitis, dementia, and eventually death if untreated. It was a direct consequence of the malnutrition enslaved people endured. A cruel irony that the bodies forced to perform backbreaking labor were starved of the nutrients necessary to survive such strain. Children were especially vulnerable, often showing signs of stunted growth and developmental delays, trapped in a cycle of hunger and illness from birth. Compounding these health crises was the lack of any systematic medical care. Plantation owners and overseers regarded medical treatment as an expense, and their investment in workers' health was minimal. When doctors were called, their approach was often more about preserving the labor force than providing genuine care. In some documented cases, treatments involved painful experiments, reflecting a deeply racist belief that enslaved people were less sensitive to pain or human suffering. Such cruelty further deepened the wounds, both physical and psychological, that ran through enslaved communities. Amid these dire conditions, the mental toll was immense. Constant sickness, the loss of family members, and the daily struggle for survival fostered a sense of despair and helplessness. Yet, even in the face of this overwhelming adversity, enslaved people found ways to support one another. They shared knowledge of traditional remedies, passed down from African ancestors, using herbs and roots in secret ceremonies that offered comfort and a glimmer of hope. Songs, prayers, and storytelling were lifelines that maintained a sense of identity and community despite the horrors surrounding them. The story of disease on cotton plantations is not just one of biology and neglect. It reveals the full extent of the system's cruelty, how it extended beyond physical labor to the very living conditions, creating a web of suffering designed to break bodies and spirits alike. Every infection, every cough, every child who failed to thrive was a testament to a world that viewed human beings as expendable tools, not as people. Remembering this aspect of history is crucial. It challenges us to see beyond statistics and economic data to the lived realities of those who suffered. It reminds us that the legacy of slavery is not only measured in fields or profits, but in the deep scars left on generations of families. It is a call to acknowledge the resilience of those who endured these diseases without proper care, and to honor their strength in surviving what was meant to destroy them. By understanding the full picture, the heat, the hunger, the punishment, and the illness, we honor their memory and ensure their stories remain a powerful warning against the abuses of power and inhumanity. Their suffering was immense, but their courage and resistance shine through, a beacon for future generations. If this story touches you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Supporting this work helps bring these untold histories to light and keeps alive the voices of those who endured so much. Through remembering, we continue their fight for dignity and justice. The system of control on cotton plantations extended far beyond physical punishment and exhaustion. It reached deep into the minds and souls of the enslaved, weaving a web of psychological manipulation designed to break their mental resilience and spirit. This was a calculated strategy, a relentless effort not only to dominate bodies but to crush hope, to sever community bonds, and to erase any flicker of rebellion before it could ignite. One of the most insidious tools used was religious coercion. Christianity, introduced and enforced by plantation owners and overseers, became less a source of comfort and more a weapon. Sunday services and religious gatherings were often mandatory, not voluntary moments of faith or solace. Instead, these events were carefully controlled to reinforce the message that slavery was divinely ordained, that obedience was a sacred duty, and that resistance would bring eternal damnation. Hymns and sermons spoke of submission and sin, drowning out any spiritual liberation that might inspire courage or unity. Plantation chapels echoed not only with prayers but with the sounds of control, their walls bearing witness to a twisted theology designed to justify cruelty and enforce submission. This religious oppression was deeply paradoxical. While enslaved people often found ways to blend African spiritual traditions with Christian teachings, creating vibrant, secretive expressions of faith that sustained them, the official use of religion was a tool of psychological control. Overseers sometimes forced slaves to memorize Bible verses that justified their suffering, or used scriptural readings to punish those who resisted. The irony was bitter. A faith meant to offer salvation was weaponized to perpetuate bondage. Public punishments were another terrifying method to erode mental resilience. When someone failed to meet their cotton-picking quota, attempted escape, or showed defiance, they were not simply punished in private. Instead, they were made examples in front of their peers. Whippings, shackling, and various tortures took place under watchful eyes, with overseers ensuring that fear spread like wildfire. The crack of the whip and the screams of the punished became a haunting soundtrack, a reminder of what awaited anyone who dared to falter. Such spectacles were not random acts of cruelty, they were strategic performances aimed at breaking collective morale, creating a climate where the cost of resistance seemed too high for most to bear. Forced complicity added a further layer of psychological torment. Some enslaved people who were caught escaping or resisting were coerced into serving as overseers, personal servants, or informants. This cruel practice placed them in an agonizing position, betrayed by their own community and forced to act as agents of the oppressive system. Their names, once synonymous with hope and defiance, became associated with surveillance and betrayal. The pressure to cooperate was immense, as refusal often meant severe punishment or death. This system of coarse collaboration sowed distrust, fraying the fragile bonds that enslaved communities relied upon for strength. These tactics together formed a sophisticated psychological strategy. They blurred lines between punishment and reward, friend and foe, faith and oppression. The goal was clear: to create not only physical submission but mental capitulation, where enslaved people might internalize their supposed inferiority and accept their fate as inevitable. Plantation society sought to extinguish the sparks of rebellion, to make slavery appear not just unstoppable, but natural and ordained. Yet, despite this systematic assault on their minds, many enslaved individuals found ways to resist. Secret meetings, coded songs, and subtle acts of defiance maintained a sense of identity and hope. The very tactics designed to isolate often created opportunities for covert solidarity. Religious gatherings, though controlled, also became occasions for hidden spiritual resilience. Where hymns carried double meanings of liberation and escape, communities adapted and persevered, finding strength in faith, family, and shared suffering. The story of mental resilience and its assault on cotton plantations reveals a grim reality, often overshadowed by tales of physical brutality. It shows us that the system of slavery was not only about controlling bodies, but about shaping minds and spirits to ensure domination. It was a war for the soul, fought in chapels and fields, in whispered prayers and public punishments alike. Recognizing this psychological dimension is vital to understanding the full horror of slavery and the remarkable courage of those who endured it. These stories remind us that freedom is not just the absence of chains but the presence of hope, dignity, and mental strength, even under the most dehumanizing conditions. Enslaved people found ways to nurture these qualities against all odds. By sharing and remembering these stories, we honor those who faced not only the lash and labor, but the profound assault on their inner lives. Their resistance, both visible and invisible, was a testament to the indomitable human spirit. If you find this history important, please subscribe to our channel to support the telling of these powerful stories. Together, we keep alive the memory of those who endured unimaginable suffering and inspire future generations to stand against oppression in all its forms. Beneath the scorching sun and endless rows of cotton, the enslaved lived in a constant state of fear, not only from the daily grind of backbreaking labor but from the brutal consequences faced by those who dared to seek freedom. The hope of escape, though fierce and deeply human, was met with terrifying tactics designed to prevent it and punish attempts with ruthless efficiency. The story of flight from bondage is one of courage shadowed by cruelty, a testament to both the desire for freedom and the horrors that pursued it. Escape was never a simple act. The landscape itself was a deadly trap. Plantations were carefully designed with dead man smile clearing strips of land cleared around the property to provide overseers and patrol riders with clear sightlines. These natural prisons, as some called them, ensured that any movement near the boundaries was visible for miles. Offering little chance to slip away unnoticed, swamps were deliberately flooded, making many escape routes impassable, while dense forests and treacherous bayous hid the desperate footsteps of freedom seekers only temporarily. If escape attempts were detected or caught, the punishment was brutal and often permanent. Overseers and plantation owners kept what was known as a book of corrections, a ledger detailing the punishments meted out for disobedience and flight. But beyond the written record, there was a horrifying physical practice that marked those who tried to break free: signature mutilations. This grim form of punishment was intended to serve as a permanent scar, a visible and unforgettable warning to others who might entertain the idea of escape. One of the most notorious methods was ear removal. This cruel act was more than pain, it was a brand, a symbol carved into the flesh to identify the person as a runaway. The loss of an ear made reintegration into any community dangerous, as it marked the individual as both punished and vulnerable. This disfigurement was a brutal reminder of the cost of freedom and a tool to isolate and shame the victim. Alongside ear removal, some were subjected to hamstringing, a practice where tendons behind the knee were cut or damaged to cripple movement. This irreversible injury effectively ended any hope of fleeing again, turning the body itself into a permanent prison. Pursuit was relentless. Bloodhounds, specially bred and trained for tracking human scent, were a common and terrifying presence. These dogs were not merely tools of capture. They were instruments of terror. Stories from former enslaved people describe how the bloodhounds would track their scent through forests, swamps, and fields with terrifying precision, often catching fugitives long before they reached safety. The psychological impact of knowing that such beasts hunted them day and night cannot be overstated. The dogs became a symbol of the overwhelming power of the plantation system and the almost impossible odds of escape. The punishment and pursuit were not only physical but deeply psychological. Those captured were often subjected to further humiliations and forced to witness the suffering of others. Some escapees were forced into roles as overseers' servants, turning them into unwilling agents of the very system they tried to flee. This forced complicity further deepened the trauma and fractured trust within enslaved communities. The knowledge that flight could lead to such outcomes complicated the hope for freedom, layering fear upon desire. Escape was rare not because enslaved people lacked courage or will, but because the entire environment conspired against them. Geography. Climate. Vigilant patrols and brutal punishments formed a seamless net that caught many before they could taste freedom. Yet, despite this overwhelming oppression, the drive to seek liberty persisted. Stories of escapes, even partial or failed attempts, spread through whispers and songs, fueling hope and resistance. These attempts and their harsh consequences remind us that slavery was not just a system of forced labor, it was a comprehensive regime of control and terror designed to prevent the very idea of freedom. The scars left by signature mutilations were not only on flesh, but in the hearts and memories of those who lived through it, a permanent mark of the brutality they endured. To remember these stories is to acknowledge the incredible bravery of those who resisted. It is to honor the risk they took in the face of unimaginable danger, and the resilience that kept hope alive under the darkest conditions. Their fight was not in vain, it laid the foundation for future generations to pursue justice and liberation. If you find this story important, please subscribe to our channel. Supporting this content helps bring these untold histories to light and keeps the memories of those who suffered alive. Together, we can honor their courage and ensure that the lessons of their struggles remain part of our shared history. On the vast cotton plantations that stretched across the American South, human lives were reduced to mere numbers on ledgers, calculations of profit and loss dictated by cold, unfeeling economics rather than compassion or humanity. Enslaved people were seen not as individuals with hopes, families, and dreams, but as disposable tools whose value was measured strictly in terms of labor output and replacement cost. This brutal calculus shaped every aspect of plantation life, from daily work quotas to the very punishments meted out to enforce obedience. Plantation owners meticulously tracked the lifespan of their enslaved laborers. Historical records reveal that the average life expectancy for a field worker was shockingly low, often estimated at just 7 years from the moment they were forced into back-breaking labor. This grim statistic reflects the extreme physical toll of constant exhaustion. Malnutrition, disease, and abuse. Owners understood that their investment in a worker was short-term, and this awareness shaped their ruthless management practices. Rather than viewing enslaved people as human beings deserving of care, plantation owners approached them as capital assets, machines to be pushed to their limits until they broke, then replaced without hesitation. Every lash of the whip, every day spent under the scorching sun, and every deprivation of rest or food was weighed against the financial return it could yield. The inhumane least-cost feeding program was a direct expression of this logic, providing only enough sustenance to keep workers alive and productive. No more. Similarly, medical care was dispensed not to heal, but to sustain labor capacity, often through cruel or experimental means. This merciless economic model extended to the tools of punishment and control themselves. Ledgers from plantations reveal detailed calculations on the return on investment ROI for items such as whips, iron collars, and bloodhounds, devices designed not only to enforce discipline but to maximize productivity by instilling fear. For example, the purchase of a pack of Cuban bloodhounds was recorded alongside estimated prevention of escape attempts and projected increases in control and order. The figures, cold and precise, stripped away any sense of humanity from the enslaved people who were subjected to these implements of terror. Owners justified these calculations as business decisions necessary to maintain profitability in a highly competitive cotton market. The enormous wealth generated by cotton exports, amounting to millions annually by the 1860s, depended entirely on a workforce that was exploited to the extreme. Plantation ledgers noted how increased punishment schedules, including more frequent whippings, directly correlated with rises in cotton production. Overseers were incentivized to enforce harsh discipline because it boosted output and, consequently, profit. Behind these numbers were real people suffering unimaginable cruelty. The Book of Pain, a chilling record kept by overseers, detailed the lash counts administered to those who failed to meet quotas or disobeyed orders. The system was designed to break bodies and wills efficiently, minimizing permanent injury that would reduce market value while maximizing the psychological impact to ensure compliance. These records were not mere historical documents, they were the testimonies of suffering etched in ink. The cold economic perspective extended even to death. Plantation owners often regarded the loss of a worker to illness or exhaustion as an acceptable cost. Some writings from the era casually note that dead are easier to replace than crops, revealing a terrifying disregard for human life. The cycle of labor, punishment, and premature death was built into the very foundation of the cotton economy. This mindset permeated every level of plantation society, shaping how enslaved people were perceived and treated. It reduced complex human beings to commodities, stripping away their identity, dignity, and value beyond the dollars they could generate. The psychological impact of this dehumanization was profound, contributing to the mental anguish and despair that so many endured. Yet, even within this oppressive economic machine, the resilience of enslaved people shone through. They resisted in countless ways, from subtle acts of defiance and preservation of cultural traditions to outright rebellions and escapes. Their courage was a direct challenge to the notion that they were merely disposable tools. Understanding this brutal economic logic behind slavery is crucial to grasping the full horror of the system. It reminds us that slavery was not just a moral failing but a calculated enterprise built on the exploitation of human lives for profit. These historical realities demand recognition, remembrance, and a commitment to ensuring that such inhumanity is never repeated. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe to our channel and support efforts to bring these histories to light. Through education and remembrance, we honor the strength of those who endured and keep their legacy alive for future generations. On the sprawling cotton plantations where human suffering was a daily reality, enslaved women endured a unique and horrifying set of abuses that went far beyond the grueling physical labor expected of them. Their bodies became battlegrounds not only for back-breaking work but for reproductive exploitation, forced childbirth under brutal conditions, and cruel medical experiments carried out without consent or anesthesia. These experiences reveal a dark layer of the plantation system's cruelty, where women's bodies were treated as tools of economic production and objects of scientific curiosity. From the earliest days of enslavement, enslaved women were subjected to relentless physical demands, but their reproductive capacities were exploited as well. Pregnancy did not grant respite from labor. Rather, it often meant continuing to toil in the fields or perform arduous domestic tasks even as their bodies were breaking down. The lack of proper nutrition, sanitation, and medical care made pregnancy and childbirth perilous. Many women gave birth in overcrowded, unsanitary quarters, surrounded by the constant threat of disease and infection that claimed countless lives. Mortality rates for both mothers and infants were alarmingly high, with many children born into this world already weakened by malnutrition and poor conditions. Forced childbirth under such dire circumstances was a profound act of endurance and trauma. Plantation owners viewed the children of enslaved women not as innocent lives to be protected, but as future laborers, investments in the continuation of the system. This meant that women were pressured to bear children who would increase the labor force, and their pregnancies were closely monitored and controlled to ensure maximum economic benefit. The constant strain on their bodies, coupled with the fear of separation from their children, who could be sold away at any moment, created a psychological torment that compounded their physical suffering. Medical experimentation added a cruel and deeply invasive dimension to this abuse. Some enslaved women became unwilling subjects in early medical studies, often conducted by physicians with little regard for ethics or consent. One of the most infamous figures of this era was Dr. Jerems, sometimes called the father of modern gynecology, who performed surgical experiments on enslaved women without anesthesia. Sim's experiments were justified by racist beliefs that black women felt less pain, a myth used to rationalize excruciating procedures inflicted without pain relief. These surgeries, often repeated multiple times on the same women, caused unimaginable suffering and long-term damage. The use of enslaved women as experimental subjects was not isolated. It reflected a broader disregard for their humanity. Medical records from plantations reveal numerous accounts of invasive treatments administered with little concern for the well-being of the patients. Conditions like infections, untreated injuries from labor or punishment, and complications during childbirth were often met with neglect or cruel interventions rather than genuine care. The physical and psychological toll on enslaved women was immense. Beyond the exhaustion from labor and the threat of violence, they faced the trauma of reproductive exploitation and medical abuse. Many women struggled to maintain hope and dignity amid these relentless assaults on their bodies and spirits. The bonds formed with their children, their communities, and their faith became vital sources of strength and resistance. These stories highlight a critical and often overlooked aspect of slavery's brutality: the gendered violence that enslaved women endured. Their experiences reveal how the system was designed not only to exploit labor, but to control and violate the very essence of their being. Recognizing this helps understand the full scope of their suffering and the extraordinary resilience they demonstrated. Despite these horrors, enslaved women played essential roles in preserving cultural knowledge, nurturing families, and fostering resistance. They found ways to support one another and to pass down stories of survival and hope. Even in the darkest of times, their courage and endurance continue to inspire and demand our remembrance. If you find this history important, please subscribe to our channel. Supporting this content ensures that these vital stories are told, honoring the lives and struggles of enslaved women and preserving their legacy for generations to come. Throughout this harrowing journey into the dark history of cotton plantations, we have witnessed unimaginable cruelty, relentless suffering, and systematic dehumanization. Yet, amid these shadows of pain and oppression, one truth shines with remarkable clarity: the indomitable spirit of the enslaved people who endured it all. Despite the brutal forces arrayed against them: physical torment, psychological control, forced labor, and constant threats, the enslaved found ways to resist, survive, and preserve their humanity. Their acts of defiance, both silent and overt, stand as powerful testaments to resilience, courage, and hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. Resistance on the plantations took many forms. Not all acts were grand or visible. Often, they were quiet rebellions, small but significant. A stolen moment to rest, a whispered song with coded messages of freedom, the preservation of cultural rituals and languages, or the secret sharing of knowledge and hope. All these were forms of resistance that strengthened the bonds of community and nurtured the desire for liberation. Even when chained and beaten, enslaved individuals found ways to assert their personhood, refusing to let the system erase their identity or spirit. Overt acts of resistance, attempts to escape, sabotage of equipment, rebellion, though dangerous and often met with severe punishment, demonstrated a fierce refusal to accept bondage. Each escape attempt, no matter how small or short-lived, challenged the notion that slavery was absolute. The stories of those who fled, risking everything for freedom, inspired others and sent ripples through the oppressive system. Their courage revealed the human yearning for dignity and self-determination that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. The resilience of the enslaved was also seen in their capacity to nurture and maintain family ties despite constant threats of separation. Families were fractured by sales and punishment, yet bonds endured through stories, songs, and acts of care. These connections were lifeline sources of emotional strength that sustained individuals through their darkest days. Reflecting on this history, We must recognize that the enslaved were not merely victims, but active agents in their own survival and in the eventual dismantling of slavery. Their resistance shaped history and laid the groundwork for future movements toward justice and equality. Remembering their stories is not only an act of honoring their courage, but also a call to remain vigilant against oppression in all its forms today. Thank you for joining us in exploring this important and painful chapter of history. Your attention and respect for these stories help keep the memories of those who suffered and resisted alive. If you found this video meaningful, please like and subscribe to our channel to support more content that sheds light on untold histories and honors the resilience of those who lived them. We appreciate you being part of this journey with us. Until next time, sleep well and take care.